First Baptist Church. How's everybody tonight? We good? Okay, y'all ready to stand up? Sing a couple of Christmas carols that everybody knows. That means y'all are going to be singing out with your beautiful voices, even if we have drainage. Y'all may be seated.
All right, very good to see you here tonight. Open your Bibles tonight to 2 Samuel chapter 16. We're going to look in 16 and 17 tonight. We are taking up right where we left off, and it was a cliffhanger last time. If you remember, David had just taken the walk of shame as he had left Jerusalem with his army and his supporters, fleeing from his own son Absalom, who had taken over the kingdom and came in to take over Jerusalem, or we'll be doing that tonight. And so we're taking up there. A couple of interesting things happened tonight in chapter 16 and 17 as we see God beginning to work and why things happened the way that they did and how God restores David. 2 Samuel chapter 16. Now remember, he's on the run, and he's trying to escape his son Absalom. And it's hard for me to wrap my head around the fact that King David, the mighty warrior that he was, is running in fear of his son, is leaving his own capital, Jerusalem. And then also, before I read this, the first 4 verses are about the servant of Mephibosheth, a man named Ziba. And when we talked about Mephibosheth a month or two ago, back in chapter 9, I read these 4 verses to you then. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them tonight, but I am going to read them because they're part of the chapter. And you may not have been here then. 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1. When David had gone a short distance beyond the summit, there was Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth, waiting to meet him. He had a string of donkeys saddled and loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, 100 cakes of figs, and a skin of wine. The king asked Ziba, "Why have you brought these?" Ziba answered, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on. The bread and fruit are for the men to eat, and the wine is to refresh those who become exhausted in the desert." The king then asked, "Where is your master's grandson?" referring to Mephibosheth. Ziba said to him, "He is staying in Jerusalem because he thinks today the house of Israel will give me back my grandfather's kingdom." Then the king said to Ziba, "All that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." "I humbly bow," Ziba said. "May I find favor in your eyes, my lord the king." When David met Ziba, the encounter met an immediate need, but it created a problem that wasn't settled until David would return to his throne. Now, we're going to see, somebody's lying, because he's going to have an encounter with Mephibosheth eventually, and when he goes back, and we've already read that as well. And so Ziba and Mephibosheth have a very different description of the account. Really, according to Mephibosheth, who was crippled in both feet, and they didn't have wheelchair accessible places or handicap laws like we do now. They didn't have wheelchairs like we do now. And so Mephibosheth was really dependent upon someone to carry him or help him everywhere he went and everything he did. The one that was appointed to do that was Ziba. So when Ziba shows up without Mephibosheth, and he says, "Oh, Mephibosheth stayed in Jerusalem because he's looking forward to Absalom," I think is the gist of what Ziba said. But David has to know that there's something off about that, because Ziba is the very one that would help Mephibosheth. And if Ziba were to just leave town without Mephibosheth, Mephibosheth couldn't do anything. He couldn't leave. He was dependent upon Ziba for everywhere he went. That said, you'll notice that David said to him in verse 4, "All that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." Now, a lot of theories about why David said what he said, but it suffices to say that David is in a pickle. He has now left his capital. He's out if you've ever been to Jerusalem, once you leave Jerusalem and you get away from the Mount of Olives, you're pretty much in the wilderness around. From places in Jerusalem, you can actually see where the Dead Sea is. And they call it the Dead Sea because not only is the sea dead, but everything around it is dead because that water doesn't grow life. And so I always say this, it looks like the surface of Mars. I was watching or looked at pictures today, or audio is the first audio from Mars. There was a little dirt twister, what do they call it, a duster or dirt devil, that was blowing in the background. You could hear a little bit. And whenever I see the picture or the video of the surface of Mars, I think, Israel. Southern Israel, to be fair. And that's where David is right now. And so there's not a lot there. And so they've left, and about the time they really have a need, Ziba shows up with tons of goodies. He's even got some wine to drink, and he's got all these cakes and bread and goodies for him to eat. So David is not about to look in all of these donkeys, which I'm sure they needed as well. And David's not about to look at Ziba and go, I don't believe you. You take your cakes and bread and leave. He accepts the gift from Ziba and then tells Ziba, all right, I'm going to give you everything. But we know in time that he's going to go back and he's going to make a judgment, and he's going to change his judgment when he retakes the kingdom. So I guess he's not in a position to argue perhaps right now, and so he doesn't. Verse 5, as King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. Now, Saul's family probably is not the biggest fan of David because Saul died, remember, in that battle, and his sons died in that battle, and so they may not think very highly of David, and certainly this guy doesn't. His name was Shimei, son of Gera, and he cursed as he came out. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops in the special guard were on David's right and left. As he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you man of blood, you scoundrel," which is an audacious thing to say to the king, but he thinks that the king is lost, frankly. It looks like he's lost his kingdom. And so it doesn't take very long before the naysayers start piling on. The sharks are gathering, as it were. And so he has the nerve to pelt him with stones or throw stones toward him, and then he mocks him. Verse 8, the Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has handed the kingdom over to your son Absalom. You have come to ruin because you're a man of blood. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head. Now, by the way, this guy Abishai could have done that easily. It was strategically a stupid thing for this guy to go out and throw stones at a bunch of soldiers surrounding King David. But interestingly, verse 10, but the king said, what do you and I have in common, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord has said to him, curse David, who can ask, why do you do this? David then said to Abishai and all of his officials, my son, who is of my own flesh, is trying to take my life. How much more then this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will see my distress and repay me with good for the cursing I am receiving today. So David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went and throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. The king and all the people with him arrived at their destination exhausted, and there he refreshed himself. So Ziba told lies, and Shimei threw stones, and both were making it hard for David. The king was now near Bahurim in the tribe of Benjamin, where the pro-Saul forces were still strong. Shimei was on the hillside opposite David and above him, and it was easy for him to throw stones and clumps of dirt at David and his people. And as I've told you before, in Israel, you're going up or down all the time. It's just a series of valleys and hills or crevices and hills. And of course, if you're on donkeys or horses, you're going to be down in the crevices because horses and donkeys don't do very well on the sides of cliffs and rocks. And so it was easy. They were easy prey for this guy as he was up and had the high ground. David was exhausted and discouraged, and yet he never rose to greater heights than when he allowed Shimei to go on attacking him. Abishai was only too willing to cross over and kill the man who was attacking the king, but David would not allow it. Abishai had also wanted to kill Saul in the camp of Israel, if you remember back in 1 Samuel chapter 26, and he assisted his brother Joab in murdering Abner. So David knew that his words were not to be treated lightly. He wasn't bluffing. He would have gone and killed the guy immediately. David's attitude was one of submission because he accepted Shimei's abuse as from the hand of God. Is that not interesting? It goes back to the remembrance that David is going through all of this for one reason and one reason only. What is the reason? It is Bathsheba and the fact that he had Bathsheba's husband murdered, and now God is judging him. In fact, God told him at the time when the prophet Nathan confronted him that there was going to be punishment and there was going to be humiliation in his future. And David, realizing it's coming, or it is now here, he is allowing it because it was already foretold by God, so he's not going to try to stop it. It's fascinating, which he could easily have stopped it at any moment. That guy throwing the rocks must have thought, when's he coming up here? Surely he's expecting them to go and kill him, but it doesn't happen. Now, don't worry, he's going to get his. I'll get to that in just a moment. So David had already announced that he would accept anything the Lord sent to him. That was in chapter 15, verse 26. And now he proved it. When David considered that he was an adulterer and a murderer who deserved to die, yet God let him live, why should he complain about some stones and dirt? And if Absalom, David's own son, was out to kill him, why should a total stranger be punished for slandering the king and throwing things at him? David had faith that God would one day balance the books and take care of people like Absalom and Shimei. Perhaps David was thinking of Deuteronomy 32:35, which says, "It's mine to avenge and I will repay." So he's depending upon God to do that. By the way, when David regained the throne, he pardoned Shimei. But later, Solomon, his son, restricted him to Jerusalem where he could be watched. When Shimei arrogantly overstepped his bounds, he was arrested and executed, and we'll see that in 1 Kings chapter 2. So in the end, Shimei gets what's coming to him. It's interesting that David pardoned him, but Solomon, his son, not so much. What did all this suffering accomplish for David? Well, one, it made him more like Christ. He was rejected by his own people and betrayed by his own familiar friend. That was his advisor. We'll get to him more in a minute. He gave up everything for the sake of the people and would have surrendered his own life to save his rebellious son who deserved to die. Like Jesus, David crossed the Kidron and went up Mount Olive. He was falsely accused and shamefully treated, and yet he submitted to the sovereign will of God like Jesus. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23 says, "Who then, when he was reviled, did not revile in return? When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously." Of course, the difference between David and Jesus is that David was undergoing all of this suffering and this humiliation because of his own sin. where Jesus went through the same kind of humiliation and suffering for the sins of others, including David and his sin. Is that not interesting? Verse 15, meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem. And so here's the big triumphant, usually when you go into the capital, it's over. It's a done deal. When you occupy the White House, you're the guy. Meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with them. Remember, Ahithophel had been the advisor of David, but he turned on him, betrayed him, and now is the advisor of Absalom. Verse 16, then Hushai, the Archite, David's friend, went to Absalom and said to him, long live the king, long live the king. Remember, last time it was Hushai that had made this arrangement with David. David told him to go back because they needed a spy. Verse 17, Absalom asked Hushai, is this the love you show your friend, that is David? Why didn't you go with your friend? Hushai said to Absalom, no, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people, and by all the men of Israel, his I will be, and I will remain with him. In other words, he's saying to Absalom, I'm your guy. You're the man. Verse 19, furthermore, who should I serve? Should I not serve the son just as I served your father? So I will serve you. He's lying, of course. Verse 20, because that's what spies do. Absalom said to Ahithophel, give us your advice. What should we do? So Ahithophel answered, lie with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench in your father's nostrils, and the hands of everyone with you will be strengthened. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he lay with his father's concubines in the sight of Israel. Now, if you remember, when David was caught in his sin by the prophet, confronted, God gave his punishment to David, told him what he was going to do, and this specifically was a part of the punishment. That as a result, out in the open, his own wives would sleep with somebody else, and so this is happening. I don't know if Ahithophel knew of that prophecy by God or not. But this is exactly what happens, just as God foretold. And so that humiliation. Remember, David left 10 concubines back in Jerusalem to take care of the palace. So that's why they were there. Verse 23. Now in those days, the advice of Ahithophel that Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. Now, when it says that Ahithophel's advice was like that of one who inquires of God, who is it talking about? He's talking about a prophet of God. So Ahithophel was such a good advisor, they practically saw him as a prophet. In other words, his advice was golden. And to lose such a key advisor was a huge blow on David and a huge advantage, or should be a huge advantage for Absalom. In fact, that was David's prayer. If you remember last time, he prayed to God and asked God to confuse or mess up the advice of Ahithophel, because he knew how dangerous Ahithophel's wisdom could be. When General Douglas MacArthur spoke before the United States Congress on April the 19th of 1951, he made this famous statement: "In war, there is no substitute for victory." But more than one military expert has maintained that armed forces can only win battles, and that in the long run, nobody really wins a war. Why? Because the price is so high. One could say that David is going to win this war. He's losing the battle now, but he's going to win the war. But the price was very high. He's going to lose his son that he loves so dearly. He won the war against Saul, but the price was high. He lost his dear friend Jonathan. And so he's paying high prices for all of these battles that he's winning. In view of atomic weapons and our modern technology, no one would win World War III. That's the theory behind nuclear weapons as a deterrent, this ideal that there will be no winners. I hope that Putin gets that he understands. The problem with that thinking is there are times where world leaders who are messed up in the head don't really have the goal of winning. They're okay with not winning as long as everybody else will lose too. Anyway, David's army and Absalom's army were about to engage in battle in a civil war that neither father nor son could supposedly win without tremendous loss on either side. If David won, it meant death for his son Absalom and his friend Ahithophel. If Absalom won, it would mean death for David and other members of his family. In modern terms, it was a catch-22 situation. Absalom was trusting his charm, his popularity, his army, and the wisdom of Ahithophel. But David was trusting God. All right, that's chapter 16, which is really a setup for chapter 17 and chapter 18. We won't get to chapter 18 tonight, but before we get to chapter 17 and continue with the story, any comments or questions about chapter 16? Okay, all right. Chapter 17, verse 1. Ahithophel, who is the wise advisor who betrayed David, said to Absalom, I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he is weary and weak, which is brilliant advice, obviously. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed. This plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. But Absalom said, summon also Hushai, the Archite, so we can hear what he has to say. So David, remember Hushai, the Archite, is the spy that David sent in. And Absalom is thinking, that's good advice. I've got this super wise guy and super wise counsel, and he's giving me a great plan. But 2 advisors is better than 1. Let's see what he has to say, and then I'll pick the best plan. He doesn't know, of course, that the guy is a spy, that Hushai is a spy. Verse 6, when Hushai came to him, Absalom said, Ahithophel has given this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion. Hushai replied to Absalom, the advice Ahithophel has given is not good this time. You know your father and his men. They are fighters, and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with the troops. Even now he is hidden in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say, there has been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom. Then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt with fear, for all Israel knows that your father is a fighter and that those with him are brave. So that's pretty good. He's putting fear and doubt in the heart of Absalom concerning the advice of Ahithophel. Verse 11, so I advise you, let all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you, with you yourself leading them into battle. Then we will attack him wherever he may be found, and we will fall on him as dew settles on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive. If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it down to the valley until not even a piece of it can be found." Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "The advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel." For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. Humanly speaking, if Absalom had followed Ahithophel's plan, which he doesn't do, David would have been slain and Absalom's problems solved. Technically, that was the way to go. But David had prayed that God would turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness in chapter 15, verse 31, and God used Hushai to do just that. Note that Ahithophel put himself front and center by using phrases like, "Let me now choose," or "I will arise," or "I will come," and so on. He wanted to be the general of the army because he wanted personally to supervise the murder of his enemy, King David. His plan was a good one. Use a small army that could move swiftly, attack suddenly at night, and have David's death as the one great goal. Ahithophel would then bring back David's followers, and they would swear loyalty to the new king. It would be a quick victory, and very little blood would be shed. Hushai was not in the room when Ahithophel outlined his plan, so Absalom called him in and told him what his favorite counselor had said. Directed by the Lord, Hushai took an entirely different approach and focused on the ego of the young king. Hushai's reply isn't a series of "I will" statements about himself, but rather a series of statements about the new king that couldn't help but ignite Absalom's imagination and inflate his ego. Amass a great army, like covering them like the dew on the ground, and who's there, who's right in front of all of them? It's Absalom. Hushai laid an effective verbal trap, and Absalom fell into it. According to Hushai, a sudden attack by a small army wouldn't even work. If the invading army were repulsed, word would spread about Absalom's forces had been defeated, and that all of his men would flee. Absalom would then begin and end his reign with a military disaster. Then Hushai presented a plan that overcame all these difficulties. First, the new king himself must lead the army. It must be the biggest army he could assemble from Dan to Beersheba. This suggestion appealed to Absalom's inflated ego, and in his imagination, he could see himself leading the army to a great victory, of course. He wasn't a seasoned military man, unfortunately, but what difference did that make? See, this is the problem with Absalom. He didn't know what he's doing. How many battles had he won? What a way to begin his reign. Absalom did not stop to consider that it would take time to gather his forces from Dan to Beersheba, time that David could use to cross the Jordan River and get lost. Hushai, of course, was interested in buying time for David so he could get lost. Verse 15. Hushai, doesn't this sound kind of like a movie? Let's make a good movie. Verse 15, Hushai and Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar, do you remember? So David left 3 people in as spies. The 2 priests, Zadok and Abiathar, and then Hushai as an advisor. So Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar, the 2 priests, Ahithophel has advised Absalom and the elders of Israel to do such and such, but I've advised them to do so and so. Now send a message immediately and tell David, do not spend the night at the fords in the desert. Cross over without fail, or the king and all the people with him will be swallowed up. Jonathan and Ahimaaz were staying at En-Rogel. A servant girl was to go and inform them, and they were to go and tell King David, for they could not risk being seen entering the city. But a young man saw them and told Absalom. So the 2 of them left quickly and went to the house of a man in Bahurim. He had a well in his courtyard, and they climbed down into it. His wife took a covering and spread it out over the opening of the well and scattered grain over it. No one knew anything about it. When Absalom's men came to the woman at the house, they asked, "Where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan?" The woman answered them, "They crossed over the brook." The men searched but found no one, so they returned to Jerusalem. After the men had gone, the two climbed out of the well and went to inform King David. They said to him, "Set out and cross the river at once. Ahithophel has advised such and such against you." So David and all the people with him set out and crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, no one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. So again, this interesting strategy paid off. David and his people were camped at the fords of the Jordan, about 20 miles from Jerusalem. And the two runners were waiting at Enrogel in the Kidron Valley, less than a mile from Jerusalem. Hushai gave the message to the two priests and told them to tell David to cross over the Jordan as quickly as possible. It was not to delay. If Absalom changed his mind and adopted Ahithophel's plan, then all might be lost. He was concerned that he might switch the plans on him. Zadok and Abiathar told an anonymous maidservant. She took the message to Jonathan and Ahimaaz, who immediately ran a mile south to the house of a collaborator in Bahurim. However, a young man saw them leave and recognized the priest's sons, and wanting to impress the new king, he told Absalom what was happening, and Absalom's guards started out after the two men. So the wife hid the runners, covering the opening with a cloth, and the cloth made it look like there was nothing there but grain. By the way, what does this sound like? Do you remember way back in the conquest of the land? There was a city, a great city. The two spies in Jericho, and the prostitute hid them as well. Just an interesting correlation. But the guards returned to Jerusalem empty-handed, but Absalom didn't see their failure as a serious problem. So these two priests, by the way, were waiting just right outside the city, waiting for the news to go take off and run and tell David. Now, the way that they were to be informed was, or these two runners were to be informed, was by a servant girl. Did you notice that? She's never named, but all of these plans that would save the life of David and all of his family and all of his army are now dependent upon one nameless servant girl who does what she's supposed to do bravely, and all are saved. You know, when I'm in heaven, I'm going to ask about her name. I don't know. I think, I'd like to know who that was. Verse 23. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order, and then he hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. So Ahithophel doesn't deal well with his advice being rejected. He had been a faithful servant of the king and the kingdom until he determined in his heart to get vengeance on David for what he did to Bathsheba and Uriah. The desire for revenge so obsessed him that he ceased to be a servant of the Lord and began to serve his own sinful desires. He knew of Absalom's ambitions and kept them hidden from David. And he cooperated with the crown prince in the palace coup. But with all of his wisdom, Ahithophel was supporting the wrong king, and the Lord had to judge him. Both Ahithophel and Absalom ended up hanging from a tree. Now, we haven't gotten to the Absalom part yet, but it is interesting that they both lose their life hanging from a tree. Verse 24, David went to Mahanaim. No, it's not Mahanaim. I see that every time I read it, because the H and the N are inverted. It's Mahanaim. Mahanaim is easier to say. If I say Mahanaim by mistake, I mean Mahanaim. And Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Absalom had appointed Amasa over the army in place of Joab. Amasa was the son of a man named Jether, an Israelite who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, and sister of Zeruiah, the mother of Joab. the Israelites and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. When David came to Mahanaim, Shobi, son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites, and Machir, son of Amiel from Lodabar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite from Rogelim, brought bedding and bowls and articles of pottery. They also brought wheat and barley, flour and roasted grain, beans and lentils, honey and curds, sheep and cheese from cow's milk for David and his people to eat. For they said, the people have become hungry and tired and thirsty in the desert. Well, that's good. So all of this is a big setup for what's going to happen in the next chapter, which we're not reading tonight. All right, so the conclusion happens fairly quickly in the next chapter. Now, next Wednesday is our candlelight service. So we won't be having this lesson next Wednesday. And then Wednesday week, we're not having Wednesday services. It's the break between between Christmas and New Year's, and we don't have services on that Wednesday. So you're going to have to wait a few weeks before we see the exciting conclusion. So you need to come back. David and his party crossed the river and came to Mahanaim, the former capital of the 10 tribes, when sons saw Ishbosheth was king. It was at Mahanaim that Jacob saw the army of angels that God had sent to protect him. Do you remember that? When he saw that army of angels in Genesis 32. But David had no such vision. However, God often uses human angels to help his servants. And this time it was Shobi, Machir, and Barzillai. They brought provisions for the king and his people and saw to it that they were adequately cared for. God prepared a table for David as his enemies were approaching, which doesn't sound unlike Psalm 23. He prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Written by who? By David himself. Interesting. They don't get a lot of credit, and their names come and go very quickly, but they were at the right place at the right time to provide for David. God saw to it that David had everything he needed for the battle that was coming. All right, any comments or questions about either one of these two chapters?
I think these two chapters are just a great example of where we should put our trust. Do we put our trust in ourselves, our own power and plans, or do we rely on the trust and plans of God?
Yes, and from a human point of view, both strategies looked good. In fact, David's strategy had less detail to it. He doesn't have this big plan, I'm going to go here and here, or we don't know about it if he has it. He just seems to be running, but he's depending upon God. His son, Absalom, thank you, he had more strategies than he needed, frankly, but he didn't have God on his side. It never occurs to him, by the way. We don't see him ever making sacrifices or praying to God or any of that. It just seems to be purely his own strategy, right? All about him. All right, anybody else? All right, we'll stop there and we'll take up there in the next chapter in a few weeks. Take your prayers.